So I am going to talk fast, and I apologize, but the good news is it is being recorded. So if you miss anything, you go back. And if you have questions, since it's only a few people on the call, feel free to interrupt. First of all, seller and buyer, these are easy. But I will tell you that you need to confirm who the seller is and who the buyer are before you write the contract or have anybody sign it. What I like to do is I like to look at the deed, and I go to the deed because, you know, not all realtors are trained super well, and so they may not have the right seller on MLS. Even the property appraiser's seller information could be not 100% right. I prefer to go to the deed, and the seller on the deed is actually the grantee for the deed that's been recorded. That's the grantee. That's the person who is currently the owner. The person they bought it from is the grantor. So in our case, confirming the seller, you want to look up who the grantee is on the deed. The buyer is simple. When you're writing an offer, that's who you're working with, right? So those two are fairly simple. Now for property description, street address, city, zip, those are easy. You can get those in the public record. A lot of properties do have multiple addresses. There's a mailing address, there's a 911 address. And so you want to make sure that you've got the correct address. Usually the one on public record is fine. You can go to Map Genius, you can confirm it that way. Put in the county on line 8. The property tax ID, that should be easy to find. So for Alachua County, it's simple. You just search, acpfl.org. And for Marion County, you just search for Marion County Property Appraiser. You can find the tax ID. Now, here's where something is different on the legal description. What I like you guys to do, and what I would prefer based on my experience, is I would prefer you just say in this box, see deed attached.
Oh, there we go.
Right? So see deed attached, instead of using what auto-populates from transaction desk. Because, when you find the property, it auto-populates in transaction desk. And that's not guaranteed to be correct. What happens is at the property appraiser's office, somebody on staff, a human being, will take what's on the deed and transpose it, like literally type it into a field on their database. And some of those legal descriptions can be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs long, so there's a chance they make a human error. I would prefer you say see deed attached and then attach the deed. And you can find the deed usually on the property appraiser's website. The concern for me is that if there's an error in the legal description on the deed, whose fault is that? It's probably the person who prepared the deed's fault. And usually the person who prepared the deed is a title company or an attorney. I would rather not propagate that error. And if the deed is wrong later, they'll have to go back and talk to the person who prepared the deed, and they have to be the ones to fix it. I'll give you an example. There's an association. There's an apartment complex on Glen Springs. I forget the name of it now, but it used to be. I think it used to be called the Cove or something like that. And then they converted over to condos. During the condo conversion, each apartment was assigned a legal description, and the attorney who assigned the legal descriptions actually made a mistake. All the upstairs units were actually owned by the people who had the downstairs units and vice versa. So the legals were reversed, upstairs and downstairs. So if I sold somebody with the wrong legal description, one of those properties, I propagated that mistake. Unless I said see deed attached. Then somebody said, oh, wait, no, this is wrong. This is for the unit upstairs. Then they go back to the attorney. So that attorney actually had to go back and fix all those legals, which is not easy to do time-wise. So that attorney probably cost himself thousands and thousands of dollars in billable hours because they had to fix their mistake. But that was their mistake. They had to fix it. It wasn't my mistake because I said see deed attached. I want to make sure you guys know, say see deed attached and attach the deed to the document. And if there are any questions about that, I'll take questions toward the end. So that's legal description. Personal property. Unless excluded below, down here, this is 1E, or by other terms of this contract, the following items which are owned by seller and existing on the property as of the date of initial offer, and then they list all these things that are included, right? Other personal property items that might be included are, and let's see, this is a recently updated contract. So let's see if they included the things in here that we care about. Like doorbells, Ring doorbells, things like that. Those things are becoming an issue. Thermostat, like see how they got thermostats here and doorbells right here on line 18 toward the end? Because everybody has those newfangled remote Wi-Fi connected doorbells and thermostats, like the Nest thermostats. What a lot of sellers were doing was they were reinstalling the old thermostat and taking the Nest with them. And the buyers thought they were buying the thermostats. So the FAR Bar committee, which prepared this document, thought it wise to add those things automatically. when I'm working with a buyer and I see all the stuff at the house, for example, if I see a shed in the backyard, I'm going to ask the seller or ask the listing agent, does that shed stay with the property or is it going? And it seems like a stupid question to ask because a lot of times they're just on the ground. But a lot of people buy sheds where they buy them from the corner, like Red Barn or something like that. You see them on the corner of Newberry Road. You see them on 13th Street where you can buy sheds and have them delivered. There's actually a YouTube channel where some guy gets paid to repossess those sheds. So those sheds sometimes are personal property if they're not permanently affixed to the ground on a concrete slab. So it's a good idea to ask. Other things I would ask about are pool. If there's a pool in the ground, does all the pool equipment stay? Some people assume the net, maybe the fence around the pool, the little child protective fence, that kind of stuff stays. That's not always the case. So you want to verify those things. So I would list all those things in here. So that's for paragraph D, personal property. Paragraph E, the following items are excluded. I had a good example recently. We sold a home in Mentone. A very nice older lady named Ms. Dinwiddie hired us. She was referred to me from a customer of mine from 2005. And the chandelier in her home was stained glass, and she made it herself because she's a stained glass artist. She said, that's not staying. I said, great. She also had other stained glass pieces throughout the home that were not staying. So I had to put in the listing agreement, these things do not convey. And what happens when they're in the pictures, a lot of times buyers will see the stuff in the picture, oh, that must be staying, that's good. You have to really spell it out clearly. So it's a good practice to recommend if there's a listing and something's not staying, if I were the listing agent, I'd recommend let's just take it out and put something generic in its place. But if there's something not staying, you need to make sure it's in the contract. So let's say you're a listing agent, you know the chandelier's not staying, and you get a contract here where there's nothing excluded on lines 24 and 25. Just because it says it's excluded in MLS doesn't mean it's automatically excluded in the contract. So, you have to clarify it in the contract. So if I got an offer on that Mentone home and they didn't specify that the chandelier was not included, in my counter offer, I'd have to say the chandelier is not conveying per MLS listing or something like that. You got to be very careful with this kind of thing. So washers and dryers, extra refrigerators in the garage, and you'll have some sellers that will do a bait and switch where they will say that they are not selling one of the refrigerators, and when they leave, the really nice refrigerator that was in the house is gone, and the crappy refrigerator that was in the garage is in the kitchen. So that doesn't really work. So you got to be careful. Make sure you know what you're buying. I learned a lesson because I had to buy a washer and dryer once. What I learned was, and it was a realtor from another office. This is when I was new in the business. He said, you know what you do? Back then we didn't have smartphones. He would buy a disposable camera and he would walk around the house and take pictures of all the appliances, not just the appliance, but inside the appliance. Like, so you see if there are oven racks missing, the refrigerator doors to see if there were drawers missing. And he took pictures of all the appliances to make it crystal clear what the appliances were in the house in case somebody tried to do a bait and switch later. So now we have smartphones. We don't have to worry about that because think about it. He bought the camera, he took pictures, he had to drop it off at CVS, have it developed, to go back and get it. How lucky are we to have what we have now, right? So that's paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, purchase price. If you are working with a buyer and you're a transaction broker, the buyer's going to say, how much should we buy the home for? My answer is, well, you have a choice. You can pay below asking, you can pay asking, or you can pay above asking. In this market, typically for competing offers, it's going to go above asking, but you can't really recommend a number. As transaction brokers, we can offer choices, but we can't tell them put this price here. A lot of people forget that as a transaction broker, you have to be more about the choices and not specifying information. If you're giving information like that, you're acting like a single agent because you're working at against the seller. As a transaction broker, we're kind of neutral and in the middle. So when they say, what price should I put on there? You can say, well, here's what the comparables are, and here's what the active competition is. Are you going to lose sleep over this house if you don't get the contract? Is it going to bother you? Are you going to cry? Are you going to be emotionally impacted? If they say yes, I say then make your best offer, whatever that is. If they say, no, I'm not really sure, I'm just testing the waters right now, then just show them the comp. Say, okay, well, you tell me the number, I'll put it in. You really should not recommend a number, okay? Now, next line, initial deposit. How much should the deposit be on an offer? A good rule of thumb, and that's practiced in our area. Now, this is in Alachua County, Florida, right? So a good rule of thumb here or in Marion County is 1 to 2%. So if the purchase price 200 grand, the The deposit should be between $2,000 and $4,000, 2 or 4 or in the middle. And then you have a choice. You can actually have it accompany the offer where, that's kind of old school. We don't do that anymore. Usually, unless you're meeting a customer to sign the contract in the office where they write you a check at the table. Usually you're writing the offer, you're sending it to them in their email to review and digitally sign. In that case, you're going to say it's to be made within blank. If left blank, then 3 days after the effective date. If neither is checked, then it's assumed to be within 3 days of the effective date. Okay. Now, what do you put for escrow agent name? If you're a Watson agent making an offer for a buyer and the buyer doesn't have a lawyer who they want to hold the escrow, you probably want Watson Realty Corp to hold the escrow. So the escrow agent name would be Watson Realty Corp. And then the address of your particular office, if you're in the Tioga office, it's Tioga. If you're in the Gainesville office, it's Gainesville. Or if you're in the Ocala office, it's the Ocala address. Phone number, email, and fax. What I recommend is in the Gainesville market, the email address should be Gainesville escrow at watsonrealtycorp.com, because that encompasses all the admins in Gainesville who handle escrow. And then if it's the Ocala office, I would recommend using Dave Farrow at watsonrealtycorp.com. Okay. And then you use the office phone number, fax, and things like that. So those are pretty straightforward. So that's the first line. That's the second line. Now, if you're down here to, let's see, this is paragraph B, an additional deposit to be delivered to escrow agent within X. You might have a situation where the customer only wants to put a small deposit down until they inspect. And once they inspect, they'll put in a much larger deposit. That's what this field is for. If you're not putting in an additional deposit, please don't leave this blank. Put 0. Okay. Put a 0 in there. Now, financing, express a dollar amount or percentage. You can do either one. I personally recommend the dollar amount because it's easier to see and the math is already done. It's in front of people. It makes more sense. So how do you know how much they're financing? Well, in this market, your buyers are going to be pre-qualified. If they want to be taken seriously, if they've gotten pre-qualified, you should have a copy of that letter from the lender knowing what they're pre-qualified for. Is it a conventional 20% down? Is if it's FHA 3.5% down? Is it USDA 100% down? Whatever it is, you should know that so you know what the dollar amount is. In most cases for conventional, it's probably going to be 5% down, maybe 95% is what you put here for financing. Okay. Other. I have never ever used the other field. I don't recommend it. I'd put 0 there. Okay. It used to be you might have a second mortgage. You might have something where the seller's doing a second, but they don't really allow those games anymore. So I would leave that 0. And then balance to close, it should automatically calculate it, but it's simply the purchase price minus the deposits minus financing, and that'll leave what they should bring to the closing table. It's important to remind the buyers that that is what you're bringing to the closing table toward the purchase price. You'll have other expenses that aren't in this line that are closing costs and things like that we'll get into later. Okay. Time for acceptance. This is pretty simple. I would recommend asking the seller how long they need first, because if the seller's out of town and a senior couple that doesn't use email and you have to do snail mail, you should give them a few days for acceptance, right? If the seller's in town and they have email, then I would say at least a day, maybe tomorrow. Like if I write the offer today, I'd say I want to know by tomorrow. Some agents will play games and say, you know what, this is a really hot market. We need to get an answer tonight before other offers come in. If I get an offer that says I need to know by 4 o'clock today and it's 3 o'clock, I'll call the seller. I'll present the offer and I'll let the seller know you have a choice. You can either counter or accept it, or you can just not answer, So you can try to play games like that where you're pressuring the seller to sign early before other offers come in. Most sellers are smarter than that, and most agents are smarter than that. So I would recommend today if they're easy to get hold of. Let's see, I'm scrolling down here. So we did time for acceptance. Closing date. Typically, a good closing date is between 30 and 45 days, but it depends on the lender. It depends on inspections. It depends on the type of financing. If it's USDA, it might be a little longer. But lean on the lender for information. And this is usually a typical residential transaction. Shouldn't be that big a deal. It should be 45 days and no more. I will typically pad it a little bit, but if it's a cash offer, you can close sooner. But if it's a cash offer where you're trying to close in 10 days or 15 days, and I would encourage you to be at least that long, you want to make sure that the deposit you collect is wired to the office, because wires faster and it'll clear faster. Closing agents won't accept the deposit where we've only received it a week ago on a personal check. It doesn't work that way because banks have the right to reverse it. Okay. So closing date, typically 30 to 45 days. Talk to your lender and make sure. Now, all this is assuming that the buyer has turned in all their information on time and done everything they're supposed to do, right? They've made full application. You can have an automatic extension of the closing date in the event of Consumer Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure requirements aren't met. So that's where they need at least 3 full days to review all of the paperwork before they sign. So if there's a significant change to the lending paperwork or something like that, that's going to cause us to have a delay because they need disclosure time for people to review stuff. That's part of the CFPB that came out of the crash in 2007. Okay. There's also something in here for force majeure that allows you an automatic extension, but typically I like to use addenda anyway, just to make sure it's clear. I don't trust default automatic things. Okay, so occupancy and possession. Unless 6B is checked, and if 6B is checked, that means there's a tenant or a lease. The seller will, at closing, deliver occupancy and possession of the property to buyer, free of tenants, occupants, and future tenancies. Seller shall have removed all personal items and trash. Now, this is at closing, right? So sometimes the buyer does their walkthrough and they're all panicked before the closing. There's still stuff in the house. Guess what? It's still the seller's house. The seller has a right to have stuff in the house up to the closing point. And truthfully, I think it's up to the point at which the deed has been signed and delivered and the money's changed hands. Technically, up to that point, it's the seller's house. So closing and possession is assumed to be at closing, the buyer can take occupancy and move in. You're going to have lots of situations where the buyer and the seller will want you to do some kind of strange agreement where there's a post-occupancy or a pre-occupancy or something like that. Take it from me, they're a nightmare. I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, so at closing, the seller should be out and the buyer should be able to get the keys to the closing table and go move into their new house. Okay. Now, if the property is subject to a lease, the buyer is buying that lease. So let's say there's a tenant in the property and the tenant's supposed to be out next month. The buyer becomes the landlord at the closing table, and any rents collected from the closing date on belong to the buyer. Okay, so those can be messy. If the buyer and the seller agree that the tenant's going to be out by closing, at the closing table the tenant's not out, then I wouldn't close it, because if you got to evict, then the seller should evict. The seller should provide the place free and clear. Depends on the arrangement. So if you run into a situation at all like that, come see me. Okay. Assignability. In this market, sellers would prefer that buyers cannot assign this contract. Why would a buyer want to be able to assign this contract? You might have somebody out there who's looking to flip, who will get it under contract and then flip it to somebody else. In markets like this, where it's a really, really, really strong seller's market, where buyers can't find what they want, you get all kinds of people out there who are just trying to make a buck being a middleman. So when I'm writing an offer and I know I'm in a competing offer situation, I'm going to say may not assign. Okay. If you think the buyer is going to be buying the property in an LLC or something like that, if I'm in a multiple offer situation, I still do this. And then I ask for an addendum later saying, hey, the buyer would like to change the name of the buyer from this to the LLC they have formed. So it's a related entity. And at that point, the seller can make a choice. But I've never seen a seller say no with an addendum after that. Okay. Financing. The best thing in the world is cash. There's no lender. There's usually no appraiser. It's faster. It's nice, right? But the reality is it's not going to be cash. It's probably going to be contract is contingent on. And if left banked in 30 days, I'm going to come back to this. Remind me about blanks after effective date. So the buyer will obtain approval for what kind of loan? Conventional or FHA or VA or other. What would other be? USDA, right? So all these other loans. So you're going to pick one of these and fill it in. Now, it's probably going to be a fixed rate. Adjustables, we haven't seen adjustables in a while, or fixed or adjustable. In my experience, fixed is where it's at, especially with the rates as low as they are, for a term of, if left blank, than 30 years. All this is very simple. What matters is the details in here. The buyer shall make application for financing within blank 5 days, right? Now, what I teach my buyers when I'm writing an offer like this, I teach them, look, making application means if there's a fee to be paid for the appraisal, you've given them the money for that. Making application is providing all the supporting documentation that the lender has asked for, so that you are truly applying with all the information you need, right? Because if the buyer didn't provide everything on time within the 5 days, technically they're in default in this contract. Okay, so the buyer should have all their paperwork, all the pay stubs, W-2s or 1099s, whatever it is that the bank wants, turned in. Now, they don't need it for the pre-qual letter or the pre-approval letter, but they certainly need it for making application. Don't let the buyers sit back and take extra time sending in that information. It's really important they're organized and have it together. A lot of that is coaching the buyer to know, hey, look, you've really got to get this stuff together now. So start getting it together while we're looking for homes. That's the time to start pulling stuff together. Okay. And buyers' failure to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period shall be considered default, right? They really need to furnish all documents and information required by the mortgage broker and lender. So it's all spelled out here. Just make sure you're educating your buyers so they know what to expect, okay? So the buyer shall, upon written request, keep the seller and the broker fully informed about the status of the buyer's mortgage loan application. That also means that the listing agent can call and say, hey, what's going on with the deal? They really, and if you're a good listing agent, you know what's happening in your deal more often than not. You're the one who's calling everybody else and being a pain in the butt. That's what you want to do. You want to be a pain so that you can inform your seller and know what's happening all around, right? Unmet expectations, in my opinion, in a transaction are the fault of the realtors. They didn't set the right expectation, they didn't communicate enough, and they didn't prepare people what could happen. Okay, so let's see. If within a loan approval period the buyer obtains loan approval, the buyer shall notify the seller in writing. Okay, if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval, but the buyer is satisfied with their own ability to obtain loan approval, and they can proceed to closing. So the buyer has some choices. When the loan approval period comes due at the end, the buyer can say, look, I didn't get the loan, but I'm waiving the contingency because I believe I'm going to, which means that their deposit's at risk. Or they can say, I did get the approval and we're going to keep going, but they got to do it in writing. Or they can say, I got rejected, I'm canceling. Okay. So those things are the outcomes. They have to do that by the end of the loan approval period. And also in the contract, the appraisal has to be back during the loan approval period. That's a new thing for you guys who haven't been in class in a while. The appraisal is now due in the loan approval period. That's a new thing. So if the appraisal doesn't come back and you know it's going to be a few more days, get an addendum that extends the loan approval period. And if the seller won't give you one by the end of the loan approval period, it's time to cancel. So if you ask for the extension on the last day and you don't get a response, by midnight that night, it doesn't matter if you asked. If you didn't get a response, it's over. That loan approval period has expired, and your buyer's escrow deposit is at risk. So don't let that happen to you. Just negotiation does not extend deadlines. Asking for the extension doesn't automatically buy you time. It's only when the buyer and the seller agree on extending the deadline that you get more time. Okay. If the buyer fails to give written notice for any of the three scenarios I gave you, the seller has a right within 3 days after the loan approval period to cancel the contract and give the buyer their money back. So within 3 days, the seller can say, you know what, you didn't tell me what happened, and I've got a backup offer that's bigger that I like better. I'm canceling this contract. Here's your money back. Go away. So imagine allowing your buyer, who you've been shopping around and working hard trying to get him a deal, to be kicked out of a contract because you failed to provide notification of one of those outcomes to the listing agent in writing. Okay, that's the important thing. Do not, as hard as you guys work to get your buyer under contract, do not let the loan approval period expire without providing some notice to the listing agent of what the outcome is. Okay, that's really important. If the buyer has timely provided written notice, the buyer but fails to close the contract, the deposit shall be paid to seller unless it's a seller's fault, is what all this says. Now, that doesn't mean that I can, as the escrow agent or the broker holding the money, I can automatically give it to the seller. We still need a cancellation where the buyer and the seller have agreed where the money should go. And if we don't have that, then I have to go to the Florida Real Estate Commission and say I have an escrow dispute. Okay. So the loan approval period is really important. All the details matter. And you do not want to allow your buyer to be kicked out of the contract because the seller's got a better deal and he's looking for an opportunity to kick you out. The only time in the contract that the seller can boot the buyer from the deal contractually is in that 3-day period. Now, sellers can break contracts, in which case there's, the buyer and the seller have a disagreement and they have to get lawyers. Sellers can try to cancel, but the contract only allows one time during which the seller can pull the plug, and that's this 3-day period. If you're in multiple offers in a market like this, do not let your buyer get kicked to the curb without them knowing it could happen. Okay. So closing costs, fees, and charges. This is pretty simple. The costs to be paid by seller. These are all standard. You know what they are, and you can read them. Okay. Now this is important to me. This field over here, it's on line 140. Other. If we're in a market where the seller is offering a concession of some kind, that maybe the seller is offering $2,000 towards buyer's closing costs and prepaids, you want to put it on this line. Okay, because it's a seller closing cost. That's where it belongs. Do not put it in paragraph 20, which is the additional comments field. Put it here, and then make sure that you point that out to the listing agent when you send the offer over so that they know. Some listing agents don't read contracts very well. They don't read closely. Don't assume they're going to read it, and don't try to pull a fast one. I'll call and say, look, we're sending you an offer. Just know that we're asking for some costs in there under seller costs, and thank you. Okay, so that's important there. So these are all standard. I'll let you read this language here. Okay, nothing exciting there. Costs to be paid by buyer, all pretty much standard costs. Now, here's the deal. Let's see. Let's go back to municipal lien search. 9C2. Yeah, I'm going to talk about municipal lien search. The municipal lien search is not automatically done. Okay. If the buyer wants a municipal lien search, they should ask for it. And in Alachua County, a municipal lien search means basically open permits. If you don't ask for it, then Watson Title at the closing table is going to ask for a waiver to be signed by the buyer. And the buyer's be like, why am I waiving my right to this? Blah, blah, blah. So because the contract says we're going to do it. If the buyer doesn't want it, then the buyer is going to be asked to sign a waiver. If the buyer wants a municipal lien search, it's going to be paid by the seller in most situations. And then the seller will have it on their closing disclosure. Okay, so then it's an additional cost. It's not a lot of money, but it's there. If the buyer is paying for their own title insurance, because the buyer says, I want to control who closes it, and the buyer is going to be paying for their own municipal lien search. Okay, these are all the expenses for the buyer in a normal situation. And then title evidence and insurance, typically it's 15 days. If it's a cash deal, I like at least 10 days, but it depends on what the closing or the title company says can be done. Okay, so in this case, it's at least 15 if it's financing. Okay, if it's not financing, it's cash, then they say 5 days. I prefer a little longer. If it's in Alachua County, that's usually possible, but if it's in Gilchrist County or one of the surrounding counties, they're not as easy to work with or a little bit more difficult. You need more time. Okay, so this is important. If I'm in a competing offer situation and I want to offer more money to the seller and I want to win, one of the strategies I will use is I will say the buyer shall designate closing agent and pay for their own title insurance. That's helpful for the seller because if you're worried about it appraising by the buyer paying this, it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the appraisal. It only affects what the seller's going to pay at the closing cost, right? If you have a seller who's out of town and wants to use a title company in Miami or West Palm or something like that, for me those are a nightmare. I'll say if I pay for the closing agent and the title insurance, can I choose who closes it? Typically that's the way it is. And if I'm a buyer, I want to do that. I like closing agents that are in the county where the property is located. Okay, so in a multiple offer situation, it might not be the buyer or it might be the buyer. Typically, the norm is the seller. The seller will do it in our area. That's traditional. So normally you'll check that. But if you're in a multiple offer situation and you want the buyer to be able to control everything, you can check this box instead. Okay. Now, Miami-Dade, I'm not going to read all that to you. Just ignore it. It's not us. Survey. At least 5 days prior to closing, the buyer may, at their own expense, have the real property surveyed and certified by a registered surveyor. If the seller has a surveyor or surveyor, that's great. The title company might work with you on it. If it's an old survey, even if the seller has one, I would recommend getting a new one anyway. I don't like to buy real estate without a current survey, so I know what's happening because you never know when somebody's encroached on your property or somebody's made a change on a neighboring property that somebody missed that affects your property line, your boundary. I want to know that. So typically I will get a new survey for myself. I will normally suggest, unless it's a recent survey, I'll suggest to the buyer, I think it's a good idea for you to get a survey because then you can also see the stakes in the ground. You can see where your property boundaries are, right? But if it's a 20-acre parcel and the seller's got a recent survey, I can see why you wouldn't want to. But for title insurance purposes and for protecting yourself, I recommend a survey. Home warranty. The buyer can ask for one. In this market, probably not going to get one. Now, if the home is really old and it's got a lot of problems, the seller might offer one just to make it easier to make sure the deal goes through. But typically in our market, it's not going to happen. So you'll say NA. Okay. This is for special assessments. In our market, normally we'll say that the seller shall pay installments prior to closing, and buyer will pick them up afterwards. If this were a strong buyer's market, and I were working with a buyer, and the sellers were hard up, kind of like 2008, I'd say the seller's going to pay for it all before closing, so the buyer don't have to worry about it after that. But in our market, it's typically A. So line 194, you would want to choose A. Okay, these are all the standard disclosures: rate on gas, permits, mold, flood zone, all that kind of stuff. So it's all legalese. Now, this flood insurance, flood zone and elevation certificate, I like to go to Map Genius, and I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to do that real quick. Can you guys still see my screen? Anybody there? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. I'm going to put in an address here. I'll put in my home address. Okay, so this is where Leslie and I live. I'm going to show you, if you look up the parcel, like if your buyer wants to make an offer on a parcel, what I'll do is I'll go into Map Genius, which is Alachua County's website. and I will say, I want to see what the flood zone looks like because I'm curious. And I can look at wetlands. So I selected wetlands. You can see there's a wetland over here on this property because it's a low area. See where my arrow is over here on the right? And if I zoom out, you're going to see other wetlands there. This is San Velasco down here. There's some wetlands in San Velasco. I'm going to zoom back in. Now, instead of wetlands, I'm going to do flood zones. Okay. I'm going to zoom out. Okay. So there's some flood zones there. See that? I check every property when I'm writing an offer on it. And if it's in red, that doesn't guarantee it's in a flood zone. That means that there is a satellite somewhere that FEMA has that suggests it's in a flood zone. The only way to know for sure whether or not it's in a flood zone is to get a survey with a flood elevation certificate. Okay. So that's the guaranteed way to know whether or not there's a flood zone. The survey trumps everything. If the survey says it's not in, it's not in. The satellite is only as accurate as satellite imagery can be. Okay. Now there's several properties in Gainesville. Let's see. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to come down here. See right here where the Gainesville target range is. Okay. There's some buildings back in here, in particular in this area, that look like they're in a flood zone. Right here, the city of Gainesville has a survey already on file. It's called a LOMA letter. They have a letter of modification that says this is not really in a flood zone. The survey has determined it's not. FEMA hasn't updated their maps, and they won't for a while. But there's a LOMA letter for that. This is commercial property. How do I know that? Because I've done business here, right? So if you didn't know that, you didn't do business here, you'd want to ask the listing agent and ask the seller if they have flood insurance, if they know they're in the flood zone. An informed seller will say, no, we got a survey. We know it's not. You can talk to the engineers of the city of Gainesville. It's not in. Okay, so that is what I want you to see about flood zone. Let me see if I can go back to my form here. Okay, so buyer is advised to verify by elevation certificate which flood zone the property is in, right? This is a disclosure. So flood zone is important. Buyer may terminate his contract, delivering written notice within blank after effective date, and buyer can. So you can do that. You have time within the contract to do it. Here is my recommendation for you for insurance, flood insurance or any insurance. During the inspection period, whether it's 15 days or whatever, I highly recommend you verify that the property is insurable. Have the buyer contact insurance companies and make sure they can get insurance on the property. Why wouldn't they be able to get insurance on the property? Well, let's say the roof is 15 years old. A lot of insurers won't insure a 15-year-old roof. Nationwide's given up on them. They won't do a 10-year-old, anything over 10. So you want to verify you get insurance. I would do that during the inspection period. Okay. There's also there's an insurance rider you can attach, but in this market with multiple offers happening all the time, all the extra contingencies you add make your offer less attractive. I wouldn't add that. I would simply make sure during the loan approval period that I could get, during the inspection period that I could get insurance. Okay. Energy brochure, lead-based paint, all these things, right? These are all disclosures. I'm going to keep scrolling. Okay. Property maintenance. Except for ordinary wear and tear, the seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, and pool in the condition existing as of effective date. So let's say that you get a property under contract and it's not going to close for 60 days and there's a pool on the property, and the seller doesn't turn the pool pump on and leaves it alone and doesn't maintain it. Now the pool is a swamp. At the walkthrough, if the buyer notices that they're buying a house with a swamp, they can go to the closing and say, look, I'm not going to close until you take care of that. You didn't maintain it the way you're supposed to. Okay. So that's where the closing agent steps in and you work it out and then you do an addendum or something. But the seller is responsible for making sure they at least maintain it in the condition it was in when you saw it. If when you saw the property it was a swamp, then, and it's still a swamp, the sellers met their obligation. Okay. Because you bought it knowing it was a swamp. But I would recommend when you do your walkthrough, don't just accept that you're going to take it and fix it yourself. Put it on the seller and make sure the seller knows, no, you're supposed to maintain this in the same condition. Other things that happen a lot of times, let's say that the furniture has been in the same place for a long time and it's wood floors and there's a lot of sun in the room. When the furniture is moved out on the walkthrough, you might see faded areas and areas where the wood is a little brighter because the furniture protected from the sunlight. That's an aesthetic issue. I've seen that actually kill a deal. So I would recommend during the inspection with something like that the inspector is actually checking underneath the furniture to look for fade or things like that. But that's an aesthetic condition. I don't think you can ask the seller to replace all the furniture because that's not wear and tear. It's just where the furniture, I mean, that is wear and tear. It's where the furniture was. Property inspections and right to cancel. The buyer shall have X days after the effective date to do your inspections. How do you know how many days you should put in here? A good realtor has a list of inspectors that they normally recommend. I would know how far out your inspectors are booking on a regular basis. So if you've got, one inspector says, look, I'm booking 15 days out, then is 15 days going to be enough for the inspection period? Probably not. You're probably going to need 17. But if your inspector says, no, I can get it done, I have a report to you in 10 days, the shorter the better at multiple offers, but be realistic. Don't say I want 3 days to inspect the property if you're going to hire a property inspector, because good luck finding one that can fit you in 3 days. And if they can, it's probably not one you want to work with, okay? Because they're not busy enough to have a lot of business. So you can read all this. The important thing about this paragraph is there's some words in here somewhere in the buyer's sole discretion. I'm looking for that. Hold on. If anybody sees it, let me know. Right here. Okay, lines 263 and 264. If the buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice. The buyer doesn't have to prove why it is. The buyer can say, look, I'm in my inspection period and I found out things about the property that I'm not interested in. So in my discretion, I'm saying, no, I'm walking away. And the buyer can walk away, okay? If the seller says, yeah, but they didn't have a formal inspection, it doesn't matter. During those 15 days, the buyer can walk away or do whatever they want if in their sole discretion they decide it's not for them. Maybe they went over there and checked it on a Saturday night because they saw it on a Sunday morning or something one weekend. And then they went over on a Saturday night of a pay week and there are frat houses all around it having massive parties or something that you didn't know about during the day. And you see that, that's a reason to walk if you don't like that idea. Or if you like frat parties, maybe that's a reason not to walk. But the bottom line is you can walk for any reason in this buyer's sole discretion. I don't recommend locking up lots of properties under contract, saying you're going to buy it in good faith just so you can walk away from the ones you don't want. That's not really buying in good faith. But the buyer does have the right to walk away on a deal if they don't like anything about the property. And they don't have to provide a reason. They can say, I am canceling the contract subject to my right in the right to cancel property inspection, and I'm walking away. I'd like my deposit back. Thank you. If it's in the inspection period, they can do that. They don't have to explain why. Sometimes people over-explain. Okay, so that's that paragraph. Let's go down through walkthrough inspections. On the day prior to the closing date or on the closing date, the buyer can perform a walkthrough. Please do not do a walkthrough for your buyer. Make them be there. Okay, if they can't be there for the walkthrough, move the closing. Okay. Now, the buyer can access the home to view it. The buyer can access the home for inspections, but not every day of the inspection period. The buyer can inspect it, but the buyer can't just keep going in and out the entire contract period just to show their friends, show their family. The seller still has a right to have quiet enjoyment of their house. They have a right to peace and quiet. The buyer does not automatically have the right to go in and out of there all the time. And honestly, neither does the listing agent. So you hear stories about listing agents going in and doing things in houses because it's a vacant house and they just assume they can. I heard one once about who let a friend of theirs stay there because they were desperate for a place and they had the keys and it was vacant. They let their friend stay in the house. Generally speaking, bad idea. Okay, so pay attention to when the buyer has a right to have access to the house. If the seller doesn't want to give them a walkthrough or doesn't want to offer them the right to do a walkthrough, the seller is kind of defaulting on the contract. That's not cool. Okay, you run into situations like that, call me, let me know, and then we'll just make sure that everybody knows what their responsibilities are. Seller says they will assist and cooperate in closing out of building permits. That's true. That's here. We had a permit on a piece of vacant land where there was a permit pulled for removing a tree. The tree was never removed, and we could prove it with aerial maps. And so the county just went ahead and closed it and said, okay, because they were holding it up. It was an open permit they were holding up. They said, well, we can see from the maps here that the tree was never removed. I'm like, exactly. I can show you pictures. And so they closed it and left it alone. So somebody pulled a permit and didn't act on it. Okay. The seller will agree to assign any repair and treatment contracts and warranties if the buyer wants them. If there are additional fees involved in the assignment, the buyer is going to pay for those. Okay. The seller's not on the hook for that. But if most vendors will say, yeah, you can take it over, and they won't charge because they want continued business. Okay. There's a bunch of legalese here on escrow agent and broker. Professional advice. So a lot of brokers make a mistake where they say they'll give them advice that is not really real estate related. I don't give tax advice. I don't give legal advice. I don't give construction advice. I encourage the buyer to rely on professional inspectors, governmental agencies, lawyers, accountants, people like that. So you want to be careful what representations you make. This paragraph is all about that. So make sure you read that and understand it. Buyers ask me for information all the time. I'm like, I can't answer that. You need to call your lawyer. I don't have a lawyer. Well, you need to get one. Okay. So it is important that the buyer and the seller assume full responsibility for selecting and compensating their respective vendors. Now, I always recommend that if you're going to offer a list of vendors, offer at least 3. I can't tell you how many times that a realtor might only offer 1. and then something went wrong and the seller is upset because they only offered one and they have an email saying this is who they recommended, I used them and I was harmed. I think the realtor is liable. So I would avoid that situation and I would say, look, here are 3 names I recommend. Now, because we have a family of services, we have Watson Mortgage and Watson Title. I always strongly recommend you include Watson Mortgage or Watson Title as one of the 3 for lenders or title companies. And I don't have a problem with that. Offer one. You might have lenders that you like. You can include them as well. Just make sure you include Watson Title and Mortgage in one of the 3 if you're offering some, okay? And I promise you this, I've used Watson Mortgage 5 or 6 times for property purchases or refinances myself. They've done an amazing job. If something goes wrong, Mr. Watson's going to fix it. He always does, okay? But make sure you offer multiple names in every situation, and then you're never going to have a problem with offering bad advice. And I don't recommend people I haven't used personally, okay? That's another rule of thumb I have. I won't recommend an inspector unless I've used them myself. And people ask why we don't have a list of recommended vendors in the office. I think it's a nightmare. I think if we maintain a list of recommended vendors, what happens if one of those vendors does a bad job and nobody knows because they haven't used them recently, and that list exists? The liability for us and for Watson is bad. I don't like those kind of lists. If you want to send a message out on Facebook, say, hey, look, I'm looking for recommendations for a roofer, then people who've had recent experience can comment and say, hey, look, I had a good experience with this person at this time. That's helpful, but at least you offered more than one, and I would like you to do that, okay? There are all kinds of situations where the buyer or seller can default and how it's handled. Dispute resolution, this is all legalese. I'm not going to explain it to you. Standards. All these standards are really important, but the most important one for me, for you guys, I'm going to go down to paragraph F, time. I want you to read this. Time is of the essence. That means if somebody does something and it's not within the period prescribed, that party has defaulted on the contract. It doesn't mean it's automatically canceled, but it does mean the other party can say, look, you defaulted, you didn't do it right, I'm canceling the contract, and I want your money, right? Or I want the deposit. So make sure you're following all the time frames in the contract. Realtors are historians. We document everything that happens during a transaction, and we document the time frames and everything. It's our job to make sure those things are happening, or at least the parties have been informed. So a good time to let the buyer know that their loan approval period is expiring tonight is not today. It was probably 3 or 4 days ago. You want to consistently remind your customers what the deadlines are. And what I typically like to do is when I get somebody under contract, I'll write an email. I'll say, hey, listen, congratulations on this contract. I'll send it to the listing agent. I'll send it to the buyer. I'll send it to whoever's going to close the deal, the lender, whoever. And I'll say, here are the key dates in the contract as I've calculated them based on the effective date. Here's the effective date. Every other period that's in there after the effective date, you just start adding from the effective date. So the effective date is day 0. The day 1 of the inspection period is the first day after the effective date, okay? And the effective date is when the last party has signed it and it has been delivered to the other party. That is when it is effective. So if you have the buyer and seller and the seller has countered your offer and they send you the counter offer and your buyer initials off on the counter and they accept it, but you don't send it back, then you have not delivered it. If somebody else makes an offer that's better and sends it to the seller, you can be kicked to the curb because you didn't deliver it. When you get a signature from your customer back, it's important you turn around and get that hot potato out of your hands and get it to the other party so that you can't be accused of sitting on an offer and let somebody else jump in. So time really is important, okay? Now, calendar days, based on where the property is located, shall be used in computing time periods. So that means that if the buyer or seller is in California, if the property is located here in Alachua County, that's Eastern Standard Time. All the calendar days are based on that. So the seller can't say, yeah, but I'm 3 hours behind, I should get favorable treatment. It doesn't work that way. It's based on where the property is located, okay? Other than time for acceptance and effective date, as set forth in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or date specified in this contract, whether pre-printed, handwritten, typewritten, blah, 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 which shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, national legal holiday, will be observed on the next day that's not. So shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal public holiday. So let's say your inspection period ends because you didn't check the calendar. It ends on a Saturday, and Monday maybe is Martin Luther King Day. Your inspection period automatically extended to Tuesday. Okay, so you want to make sure you're paying attention to those things. It's not true for time for acceptance or the effective date. Okay, but it is true for all the other time frames. So if your closing date was set on a Saturday and Monday's a holiday, well, now the closing date automatically defaults to Tuesday. Okay, make sure you look at your calendars when you write the offer so nothing catches you by surprise. I've seen lots of disputes sometimes. No, it's supposed to end on this. Well, the contract paragraph F says, no, it kicks over to this date. Now, notice it says the next calendar day. That is not a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday. It used to be 5 o'clock the next business day is when it would extend to. Now it extends to midnight the next day that's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So a calendar day ends at 11:59 technically. Okay, a business day ends at 5 o'clock. It doesn't say business day anywhere on this contract anymore. Okay, that's important. But the first line is the most important. It says time is of the essence, right? So several more definitions here. Let's see. I'm looking for notice. Let me see if I can go back and find notice. Because there's also a new change recently. Give me a minute here. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through to find it. What's important for you guys to know, if I can't find it, it specifies that anything that's done in writing is what matters. And text messages are not in writing, okay? So you cannot use text messaging in negotiations of a contract and have it be legally binding anymore, okay? Just because you have a text from the buyer's agent that says the buyer was willing to go up to this number, that's not in writing anymore. That's not considered a valid form of written communication. It has to be an email, a fax, a letter, something handwritten, or a contract or an addendum. It cannot be a text message. So please do not use text messaging in negotiating, okay? And let's see. I'm looking here. All notices right here, line 531. All notices must be in writing and may only be made by mail, facsimile transmission, personal delivery, or email. Where in those two lines do you see the word text? Nowhere, right? So please do not use text messaging when negotiating. I promise you it won't hold up in court. So those are all those, and I'm gonna keep scrolling. These are all more standards that you should read, but nothing burning here. Okay, this paragraph 19. If you've got addenda that are checked, like for example, sale of buyer's property or backup contract or short sale or any one of these, if you have not included in the paperwork and it hasn't been signed off by the buyer and the seller, but it's checked here, you don't have a valid contract. You might have a signed contract, forget to include one of these addenda where the addenda is supposed to be included and you don't have it signed. That's not a completely signed contract. Your seller can accept something else if they want it now. You've left your buyer exposed. Make sure if you check one of these that you have included that addendum and it's been signed off by all parties. I've seen deals, especially recently, because people keep getting backup offers where the numbers are going up and up and up. Everybody's looking for reasons to get out of the current contract. Don't be the reason somebody got out of the contract. Make sure if you check one of these that you include it, okay? Additional terms. This is no man's land. Please do not write in this area at all. If you have to, for any reason, talk to me or talk to Sherman or talk to Solvig about whatever's in there and make sure that the language is clear to them or me, because this is where realtors get in trouble. If you write something in here that pertains to the inspection period, what you write here can actually negate the entire paragraph on inspection periods. What's written here can negate other parts of the contract, and you and I are not lawyers. If you need a clause or something creative, talk to me about it, and I'll reach out to one of the attorneys that we do a lot of business with and see if they have a clause I can include. If we need something really complicated in here, guess what? Have an attorney write the contract. Don't do it yourself. Additional terms is not a place for realtors to think they're lawyers and write paragraphs of information. The other thing you don't want to do in here is you don't want to try to address anything related to commissions here. Sometimes a buyer's agent isn't happy with a cooperating fee of 2% or something and say buyer and seller agree that the cooperating agent would pay 3%. It doesn't work that way. This document is a contract between the buyer and the seller. It has nothing to do with brokerage and nothing to do with commissions, okay? So I'm going to keep scrolling. They can check this box if the seller's countering and send it back and make changes. What I would like you guys to make sure you do is include, and this is where the buyer is going to sign, right? And the seller sign, make sure you include this information completely. The buyer's address for purposes of notice, seller's address for purposes of notice. I've had agents push back on this. They don't want to fill it out. If it wasn't necessary, it wouldn't be here. The reason we like this is because the Florida Real Estate Commission, when they have to do an escrow disbursement order, they want to be able to send letters to the buyer and the seller. And those lawyers get snippy when you don't have all this information in here. It's not completely filled out. Please fill it out, okay? Now, listing and cooperating brokers, if any, named below, are the only brokers entitled to compensation, and this spells it out, right? Now, you'll see sometimes when, let's say that Mark Ulmer is the listing agent and Watson's the listing broker, and the buyer's agent and the buyer's broker over here, and the buyer's agent says Max Levy or something like that, and 3% in parentheses, thinking he's going to increase 2.5 to 3 or 2 to 3. This last line here says this contract shall not modify any MLS or other offer of compensation made by the seller or listing broker. They can be cute, try to put stuff in there. It doesn't matter. That line alone right there says it doesn't matter. Commissions are not to be dealt with in contracts, period. Okay. So that is the as-is contract. I'm not going to go through the regular contract, but I will one-on-one if somebody needs to. And I will minimize this window and I will ask if anybody has questions. You guys can unmute yourself if you have questions. I can't hear anybody.
Nope.
Nope. Good. Catherine, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're on the call. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing, boss?
Yes, sir.
Earlier when you spoke about cash buyers and them waiving an appraisal, I understand because of the market being so crazy that they're maybe afraid somebody might sneak around them or something. But wouldn't they want an appraisal just so they don't overpay even more than they normally, well, than they would?
You know, I would say it depends on the buyer. Some buyers are more risk averse than others. Some buyers are really sensitive to it. But I will say this. If the buyer absolutely has to have an appraisal and they want it subject to appraisal, then you should use the appraisal addendum and add it, okay, for a cash deal. If the buyer says, I don't care if it meets purchase price, I'm still going to get a loan, and as long as it appraises for enough for me to get the loan, I'll be fine, then you can just use the paragraph that's in there about the loan approval. But I will tell you, I've seen situations where the buyer is really strong. Let's say it's a $100,000 property and the buyer is buying it for his daughter or something, and the buyer's got $1 million in the bank, but he wants a loan. So he's gonna get the loan no matter what, whether it appraises or not. The bank's gonna say, you know what, you got enough money, and if it appraises for 80% of whatever, we're gonna give you the loan. But if the buyer absolutely has to see an appraisal that shows it appraised for $100,000, the language in the contract isn't enough for that. You need to add the appraisal addendum that says buyer and seller agree that if the property doesn't appraise for purchase price, buyer may cancel the contract and walk away money in hand. Okay, and then you can specify the time frame too, and then you can say the appraisal can be, the day before closing or something on that. Otherwise, the contract says the appraisal will be back in the loan approval period. And if the buyer is strong enough and the property doesn't appraise, the lender may say, you know what, I'm happy, I'm still going to give you the loan. I've seen the buyer be upset by that because they wanted it to appraise. They wanted to buy it at value, not undervalue. The bank says, too bad, I'm approving you. Now, if the lender gives you a letter that says you're not approved because it didn't appraise, that's okay. But if it's absolutely crucial that it appraises, use the appraisal addendum. Good question. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, I think this thing recorded, so please.
Hey, can you hear me?
No, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
I hear you now.
Okay, so just to back up a little bit, because we're busy looking for condos for people that are moving here with their kids. They want to get them into UF, blah, blah, blah. And some of the condos are leased like through maybe even September, October.
Yep.
So did they just, like, what forms do we use for that?
So you're going to make an offer, and the buyer needs to know they're buying it subject to the lease. So the buyer becomes the landlord. At the closing table, you need to make sure the closing agent knows this. At the closing table, the closing agent is going to do an assignment of lease. And that's a legal form that says that the seller is stepping out as landlord and the buyer is stepping in as landlord, which means that the buyer needs to be able to see a copy of the lease. So if you're buying a property with tenant in place and you're doing that, I want to see the lease front to back and I want to read it. I want to know all the terms in there. And in that situation, I highly, highly, highly recommend that the buyer have a lawyer review the lease, because the buyer is buying everything that's in that lease. And if that lease says that the tenant has an automatic right of renewal with a week's notice or something, that buyer is stuck with that tenant for as long as that tenant renews. That's why it's a good idea to have a lawyer review it, right? So I strongly encourage you to do that. Now I'm gonna share another screen with you for a second, because I want to highlight some things that we talked about. Any other questions before I do that? Okay.
I think you mentioned something.
I have one question.
About blanks at the end.
Yeah, yep. I'm coming back right here, right now. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
Yes, Carlene, I heard you. Yep. Can you guys see something that says great practices to follow?
We can see it.
Okay, good. Now, Carlene, you had a question. Go ahead.
So if you're saying that we should not put the commission on the comments, is there an extra document that we should do? Like, let's say I had a Facebook and the Facebook's paying me a 3%.
Yeah. So in that case, you want a compensation agreement or a limited service listing agreement. You need an agreement between the brokerage and the seller specifying who's paying who and how much. Okay. You never use the contract for that. The contract is an agreement between the buyer and the seller, not the broker. I think it's tacky to use the contract for commissions because it's non-binding anyway. What I would do is I would use a compensation agreement or a limited service listing agreement, okay? And then if, here's another thing, the code of ethics will not allow you, let's say there's a property on MLS and the cooperating commission they're offering is 1%, okay? You are allowed as a listing agent to call the listing or as a cooperating agent to call the listing broker and say, hey, look, I like this property. I'd like to show it to some people. Can you please offer me 3% instead of 1%? You're allowed to do that up to the point where you're getting ready to make an offer. If you make an offer, you cannot make an offer and say, by the way, I want 3%. That's a violation of the code of ethics. It has to be before you make any offers on the property. You can try to renegotiate commission. Most listing brokers might say no. They might give a little bit, but if you make an offer and then you ask, you've violated the code of ethics. Don't do that, okay? If you're in a situation where you feel like it's not fair and you want to get more money, call me and let's talk through it on a case-by-case basis. But if you've already made the offer, it's too late. You can't do that without violating code of ethics. Does that make sense? Nobody likes 1%
Yeah,
cooperative fees. I think that's tacky. Go ahead.
I have another question too on the where we pick the title company. There's one that says Miami-Dade. Can you explain that one?
Well, that one doesn't apply to us. It only applies to properties in Miami-Dade County, and I don't use it. I've not done it, so I won't explain it to you.
So I received an
If
offer
it's a
the other
property in
day.
Marion County or Alachua County, that's different. Now, if it's a title company in Miami that wants to close a deal for a property in Alachua County or Gainesville, that's on them. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that you have to just look at that paragraph.
Well, I received an offer with that paragraph checked, so that's why I'm asking.
But where was the property?
In Marion County.
That doesn't make any sense.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, no, that is an agent who is not educated. Okay.
Okay, so if
that
the
paragraph
property
is
is
only, scroll up. That paragraph is only for properties that are in Dade County.
in that county. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
So, yep, no, I'm glad you asked. Yeah, it only applies. I'm looking for it right now. It only applies to properties there. And in Alachua County, Marion County, we don't deal with it. So there it is right there. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank
in Miami, Broward Regional, buyers will designate closing agent, seller shall furnish a copy of prior policy. And so all this language here is for them. And I'll tell you, the municipal lien search in Dade County is required. Okay. So Alachua County, it's not. I don't think it is in Marion, but so you only check that when you're dealing with Miami or Dade properties. Okay. Now, on the great contract practices to follow, that's what you're looking at right now. The first one, attach the deed and say see deed attached, right? Do not trust the legal description that came over from transaction desk. Take it out and write see deed attached, please. Is that clear? And then attach the deed. The second thing, do not leave blanks because there's a default value. Just because it says 3 days if left blank, sometimes people leave it blank thinking it means 0 or something. If you intended that blank to be a number, write it in, even if it's the default. Because this way the other party knows you didn't miss it, you intended something there. I don't like the default language where if left blank, it's this, because I can't tell if you meant to leave it blank or if you meant the default number. Put the number in that you intended, and if it's 0, put 0. Whatever it is, fill it out. It takes a few extra seconds and it's far more professional, okay? Next, verify that the property is insurable during the inspection period. We talked about that, right? Because of roofs, the roofs issues are a big deal, and also the flood insurance issue. If it's in a flood zone and you're and it's a nice house, reasonable size house, and the flood insurance is $5,000 a year, your buyer may not want that. It's better to know that in the inspection period than not in the inspection period, right? So make sure you get all the information about flood zone and insurance during the inspection period. If the survey is not going to be done in time to know about flood zone, you can get an addendum. You can use an addendum that extends the inspection period until you get the survey back, or you can attach a flood zone addendum to it that allows you some extra time, the insurance rider. So just make sure that you verify whether or not it is. If the seller says I have to have flood insurance and I had a survey that was done a year ago, guess what? They probably have to have flood insurance, and so will your buyer. Okay. Don't write in paragraph 20. That's the additional comments field, unless it's life or death, or you have spoken to your sales manager or your broker. Okay. Please don't use that big blank field at the end of the contract. You see a lot of people be creative, and I can tell how poorly trained an agent is by how many words are in that paragraph. There should be 0. Okay. Unless there's something really unique, and then call me and let me know. If the seller is offering concessions like money or extra cash or something, included under the seller closing costs on that blank that I showed you. Read the contract front to back weekly at least. A lot of people use these contracts and they just automatically fill in from blank to blank to blank without reading what's in between them. That's a bad idea. I think as a licensed professional in the state of Florida, you should read everything in between those blanks and know what they mean and know why. Because if you're negotiating and let's say you haven't paid attention to the fact that 3-day period in the loan approval language where there's a 3-day period where the seller can kick you to the curb. If you didn't know that because you didn't read it, you harmed your buyer if your buyer got kicked out of the contract, and the buyer could sue. So make sure you pay attention to the timeframes, you document them really well, and you make sure you have not given that seller an opportunity to kick the buyer out. Now, if you're the listing agent and you got a backup offer and the seller is looking for a reason to get out, that's an opportunity for the seller maybe to cancel the contract, but use that cautiously because you're burning the other realtor, and the other realtor is going to say, okay, I'm not doing a deal with you anymore. Every deal that you do with another realtor is an audition for more business. Try to be fair, try to be straight up, and try to be honest as much as possible within the license law so that you are somebody they want to do business with in the future, right? Make sure you're doing that. But read the contract front to back at least, especially paragraph 18F. A lot of times people forget what's in that paragraph. They forget the time frames and they'll call me and ask, hey, how many days do I have for this, blah, blah, blah. My first question is going to be, which contract is it? And you're going to say, oh, it's the FAR Bar Edge. They'll say, great, go to paragraph 18F. I'm going to refer you to this language, and you should read that language carefully all the time, okay? Get to know your contract extremely well. And then when there's an update to the contract, get to know that new version of the contract extremely well. Last thing I'm going to tell you is there is no limit to how many you can write in a month, okay? You can write as many contracts as you want in a month. There's no limit. Just make sure you're professional, you're doing a good job, and you are representing your customers well. And if you have any questions or concerns, call me.